Hi guys, and welcome to this week's video. It's a tutorial. It's a tutorial all about your aperture. Knowing and understanding how your aperture works will greatly increase the way that you could be creative with your photography for any genre. Photography is a science, so if you get to know the science a bit more, then trust me, it can only help and improve your photography. Before you switch off, this video is designed for beginners and intermediate photographers alike, but if you think you know all about how your aperture works, do me a favor, take this quick test. I want you to take a look at this picture when it flashes up, and I'm going to give you 10 seconds to tell me what aperture you believe the images or the image was shot at. Bearing in mind the subject, which is these two fantastic army corgi vehicles from the 1960s, all originals by the way. They weren't moved, so I didn't move them. Okay, right. So I'll flash the image up and you've got 10 seconds. Let's make it 5 seconds. Let's put you under a bit more pressure. I'm going to give you 5 seconds for you to tell me what aperture you believe these were shot at. First image, go. Look at the gorgeous shallow depth of field in that image. Well, it was shot at f16. How many of you said f2.8 or f4? Now take a look at this next image. Go. Well, that was shot at f5.6. There's not much difference between them though, is there? Between f16 and f5.6, you'd expect it to be a much greater difference than that. What about this last one? Go. That was shot what we call really wide open, which means it was shot at 2.8. That's your apertures for you. So I'm guessing some of you right now are slightly confused. Well, if you are, then stick around because this tutorial is for you. Before we move on, let's take a quick look at these pictures side by side. The picture on the left-hand side was shot at f16, and yet clearly it has a much shallower depth of field than the picture on the right-hand side that was taken at 5.6. So some of you that think that you know how your aperture works are probably making an assumption right now that I've messed up and I've got my pictures or my settings the wrong way around. Well, I haven't. The picture on the left-hand side was definitely shot at f16. The picture on the right-hand side was definitely shot at 5.6. And I didn't move the cars any distance away from each other. They never moved at all. I used exactly the same lens and the same camera to shoot both of the images. Now, the reason why the picture on the left-hand side has a shallower depth of field than the picture on the right-hand side is because there is an anomaly. When it comes to how your aperture works, there is an anomaly. But I'm going to cover that anomaly towards the end of this video when I create a summary of how your aperture works. If you're desperate to find out what that summary is, then you can skip to this timestamp now or just wait until you get to the summary part of the video. Right, let's get down to the science of photography. And the reason why I want to get to the science of photography, because photography is a science. Irrespective of the camera, make, model, brand, or even type, photography is a science. Mirrored, mirrorless, medium format, micro four thirds, it's irrelevant. The fact is, your photography is a science and it all works in exactly the same way. So what is your aperture? Well, there's two things to discuss here. One is how your aperture controls light. Two, which is the most exciting part, is the creative aspect of your aperture. So what your aperture creates in terms of creativity. Well, let's talk about the light to begin with. Your aperture is just a hole that lets light through onto your sensor. Your aperture lives in your lens, and your camera controls the aperture, but the aperture lives in your lens. So remember that, it's very important. That did change ever so slightly going back to maybe some of the really earlier 1960s. There were some oddball cameras where the aperture was controlled within the camera, but it's irrelevant. The fact is, it did exactly the same job. So, number one, your aperture is just a hole that lets light through. Without stating the obvious, you have a large hole that will obviously let lots of light through, and in gradients, it goes all the way down until it's a very small hole that doesn't allow much light through at all. There you go. So in terms of light, your aperture lives in your lens, and it's simply a hole that lets light through. Nothing any more complicated than that. In actual fact, let me grab my camera. If I just wind this film camera on, I've got it set to bulb mode. That means now when I depress the fire button, the shutter will stay open as long as I keep my finger depressed on the fire button. Now, as you can see, it's a very, very small hole, a very small hole. So as I turn the dial to open the hole, you can see now the hole getting larger and larger and larger. Obviously, when it gets larger, it will allow more light through onto your sensor, and the opposite way around. Smaller, allowing less light onto your sensor. So irrespective of what camera, make, model, brand, how cheap it is, how expensive it is, your lens or your aperture works in exactly the same way. Pretty cool, that, isn't it? 1839 cameras were put into production for the masses, for the public, and the science and technology is exactly the same today as it was then. How cool is that? So now we've established how light falling through the glass on your lens travels through the aperture that controls the amount of light that now falls onto your sensor. I think the best way of demonstrating this is to do it the old-fashioned way, on a piece of paper using a pen. So let's have a quick look at this now then. So let me lay out what is likely to be most apertures in most lenses. Let's have a look then. So what we're talking about now then is large, half the size, until we get to a very small one. Okay, so without stating the obvious, they're representative of the apertures that are currently or is likely to be in the lens that you have on your camera now. Now, this is where people get slightly confused. When we now add the numbers to represent, or the numbers that represent the size of the holes, watch, let me give you an example. The first one is, let's assuming that your lens can go as wide open as 2.84, so 5.6, F8, F11, F16 and F22. F stands for focal. Okay, right, now, so there we've got an array of different size holes, different apertures, allowing light to pass through onto your sensor, and they are represented by these numbers. Now, the only confusing part of this scenario is the fact that the largest hole is represented by the smallest number, and the smallest hole is represented by the biggest number. But if you can get your head around that, then it's really, really easy to understand. But you do have to get your head around that. And when you first start out in photography, if you're new to this art, then sometimes it can be a little bit bewildering. But f2.8, you might have that on your lens, you might not have that on your lens. If you turn the aperture on the front of your lens, then when it gets wider and wider and wider, if you actually zoom out and then turn your aperture dial until it gets wider and wider and wider, then you'll end up with the smallest number that your lens will allow, because they can vary greatly. A lot of lenses will go wider and wider and wider again, and of course some lenses will go smaller and smaller and smaller again. So in terms of your aperture and what these numbers actually mean, well, in this particular instance, f2.8 is a small number and is represented by a very large hole. f4, believe it or not, is half the size, and 5.6 is half the size again. So as these travel down here, Each, in this particular instance, is getting half the size, half the size, and half the size, all the way down to 2.8. And then it goes twice as big, and twice as big. These are just what we call prime numbers. It's just the easy numbers to remember. If you want to get sciencey and start learning the numbers, then roughly these are the numbers that you need to learn. The chances are, I don't want to get too confusing at this stage, but your camera will be set in increments of third. That means if you are able to get to f2.8, then it'll be 1, 2, 3 clicks before it gets to f4. 1, 2, 3 clicks to get to f5.6. Each one of these is represented by one stop of light. In actual fact, every time you double or half one of your 3 elements, ISO, aperture, or shutter speed, whether you double or half any one of the 3 of them, that is called one stop of light. Okay, so now that we've established what these numbers mean relative to the size of the hole, what else does our aperture contribute to this wonderful world of photography? Well, your aperture controls depth of field. Depth of field is an amount of image that's in focus as opposed to an amount of image that's out of focus. And the easiest way to remember these numbers relative to the amount of depth of field that they control is simply this. The smaller the number, the shallower the depth of field. The greater the number, the greater the depth of field. Now that we've covered how your aperture works, you're probably slightly confused by these 2 pictures. Let's put these 2 pictures back up again. Because I clearly said that a small number creates a shallow depth of field and a big number creates a great depth of field, a much larger depth of field. So surely I must have got these pictures the wrong way around, or the settings the wrong way around. Well, look, I haven't. Let me explain to you what the anomaly is. And the anomaly is simply this. Watch. If you imagine, if I photographed this car from here, this is my camera here. I am photographing the car straight on. Didn't really matter what angle the car's at, it's irrelevant. I'm photographing the car from this angle, aiming this way. Now, if I opted for a shallow depth of field, then let's assume your lens will go down to 2.8, maybe 3.5 if it's a kit lens. Then focusing from here onto the car here, the shallow depth of field is only this amount. Okay, remember at 2.8 or 3.5. I'm at this amount. Now, I'm not going to change the settings on the camera at all, but watch. This is where the anomaly happens. Camera, I'm not going to change the settings. I'm not going to move the car, but I'm going to move the camera away from the car. As I move the camera away from the car without adjusting the settings, that shallow depth of field starts to increase. That's the only anomaly that you have to know and understand about your aperture. But watch, that's at 2.8, maybe 3.5. I'm really close to the vehicle. If I shot this at f16, the shallow depth of field is only that much. It's very slight. The difference is very, very slight, simply because the camera is so close to the subject that I'm photographing. But when I now at f16 move the camera further away, that will instantly grow and grow and grow exponentially as the camera moves further and further away. So how I tricked you into you believing that I've messed up is simply this. I photographed the car, the first shot at f16 that creates the shallow depth of field, simply by moving the camera as close as I possibly could. But then when I got a shallow depth of field, let's say that much, it's irrelevant, roughly that much. But then when I opted for the 5.6 image that I'm making a comparison with, 5.6 is that much. But I moved the camera further away. When I moved the camera further away, obviously I then zoomed into the picture. I then ended up with a much greater depth of field at 5.6 than what I did at f16 when I was much closer to the vehicle. So yeah, okay, it's a little bit of a trick, granted, but how many people actually knew that the shallow depth of field really is much more pronounced and is only really visible when you focus close to the subject. So I'll give you an example. When we teach here in the studio, when we talk about your aperture, I always tell people, grab your camera, grab a subject, let's use a shallow depth of field, and let's see if we can really create a shallow depth of field image where the background is blurred, more blurred, then really blurred, and so on and so forth. And most people tend to set a subject up here and take your camera here. Now, because you're so far away, even with a shallow depth of field, it's not pronounced. So if you do want to play around with a shallow depth of field and experiment with it, then remember, the closer you are to the subject, the more pronounced your depth of field will be. Carrying on with that summary, let's talk about, I mentioned earlier I was going to offer what I consider to be the best settings for landscape photographers. Well, according to the science of photography, it's got to be f22, isn't it? Surely if you're at f22, then everything from tippy toes to as far as the eye can see will be in focus. Well, that's correct. That's absolutely correct. The science doesn't lie. The science is correct, except for one thing. Most lenses don't perform very well at the furthest points. As in, if you bought a lens that say offered a range of f2.8 to f22, then your lens won't perform brilliantly at its furthest point of 2.8 and its furthest point at f22. Yes, the science will dictate that f22, all landscape photographers in theory should just set their camera to f22 and then just get on with it. It's not really a problem. But like I said, the problem is when you get to the furthest points in the ranges of the lenses, they tend not to perform very well. Sometimes at f22, I shoot mine at f22. I don't have a problem with mine. If I need to extend that shutter speed, then I don't mind closing that aperture right up to f22. You'll see that on on a lot of my older videos. I'm actually shooting at f22. But because I mentioned about the anomaly, as in the further away you are from the subject, that shallow depth of field greatly increases. Therefore, twofold. One, around about f8 or f11 tends to be the sweet spot. In other words, anywhere roughly in the middle of the range of your lens tends to be the sweet spot. But f8 and f11, because the chances are you'll focus roughly a third of the way into the frame, those not only will perform better, not only will be probably the sharpest settings within the range of your lens, but because you're focusing so far away on a mountain range, then everything from tippy toes to as far as the eye can see will be in focus at f8 or f11. It varies ever so slightly with different types of cameras. So a micro four thirds, for instance, I won't get into that now, but a micro four thirds, you're going to be around about maybe f5.6 or f8 will be your sweet spot. But either way, it's the middle of the range, irrespective of your camera make, model, or brand. There you go. I think we've covered your aperture, and the most important thing to remember, if you want to experiment with shallow depth of field, the closer you are to the subject, the more pronounced it will be. That's it. Hopefully you've enjoyed this video. If you have, give it a thumbs up and subscribe and all the normal shenanigans. And please don't forget to leave a comment below. I like to have a bit of banter back and forth. It's always good to have and read your comments. Cheers.